Chapter 13. Glogu's death had occurred in late summer. All winter long, Leaping Fawn had kept steadily to her task. Young as she was, she had sustained it like a stable, mature woman, and for this she won the admiration of all. And now it was spring. The annual Sundance was only a little more than a moon cycle away. Since the families were ready for the final ceremony, it was decided to hold it just before the move to the Sundance site. During those preliminary days, they were always spent in greeting new arrivals and holding family ceremonies and rites all around the circle. It was Rainbow's idea. When he talked with his brother-in-law, Black Eagle, about it, he said, "It does not seem right for my niece to carry an adult burden any longer, so why not cut the mourning period a little short? Are we not ready, even now, to hold the Ghost Feast and Redistribution? Why prolong the time?" Black Eagle was in accord with that. "You are very right. We are well prepared. I have known of cases wherein families require 2 whole winters. Fortunately, ours is a big family, and all the relatives are loyal and helpful. Then, too, we have countless friends who have helped." Both men agreed to that. It was largely the dead woman's own knack of friendship that had brought that response in her behalf. The relatives all bestirred themselves, and the plans were going well. When the 2 handsome American horses that Black Eagle intended to give away in his mother-in-law's name as a final impressive honor to her were found dead, the boys who tended the horses came in with the report. Some vicious or jealous person had stabbed them in the night. It was useless to blame it on crows or Mandans or the lurking enemies. They would never injure Dakota horses. They wanted them alive too much. No, this was the work of spiteful tribesmen. Black Eagle felt his loss keenly. He had named those 2 extra fine animals to be the chief gifts at the distribution. He had meant to start off by giving them away in his mother-in-law's name. It was to have been his last princely gesture to her. "If only I could know who did this," he said to his friend sitting with him. "If I could learn that it was not a responsible man of standing, but a natural fool, then I should be consoled. I should say, well, after all, he did not know any better. It was the same as an accident, and then I could overlook it." "Why don't you consult a diviner, my friend?" one man suggested. Black Eagle thought that a good idea. He might act on it later on, but first he must find 2 horses at least as good to give away. That was his immediate problem. It did not free him from that through no fault of his own. The ones he had set aside for his mother-in-law to give away posthumously had been lost. He was still obligated. This problem was preoccupying him while the womenfolk were toiling feverishly to get things ready, and the ghost dreamer White Hand, who had been in charge since the start, was fasting and purifying himself in the sweat bath for his final duties. And then, at high noon, while all this was going on, Waterlily was bought. 2 strange women approached from the opposite side of the circle, each leading a very handsome horse laden with presents. The women were attractively gowned, and they walked with purpose, heading directly for Black Eagle's group. They tied the horses outside Rainbow's teepee, and then withdrew, saying nothing to anyone. All who saw them knew what it meant, nor did it take long to learn who the women were. The go-between they had sent on ahead had found visiting relatives on the way and had stopped to see them. Belating, he reached Rainbow's teepee with the necessary facts. Far to the south of here, Bear Soldier's people move regularly about the Black Hills region. From there comes a man of renown called Good Hunter to attend our festivities. He brings 2 of these 3 wives, and it is they who offer gifts for your daughter, and that she may become the wife of their son, Sacred Horse. He explained that Good Hunter was an uncanny marksman. Because of that, he was a very influential, well-provisioned man. He was able not only to take care of his 3 wives and their families, but also to maintain a large retinue of kinsmen besides. The son's sacred horse was a child beloved, and all three mothers set great store by him. His every whim they strove to satisfy. Their chief aim in life was to see him happy. Consequently, when he had chanced to say that morning that at last he had seen the girl he wanted, they quickly set out to bring fine presents for her, hoping to take her back to him when he returned from riding with his friends. It was considered a high compliment to have such an offer. Old women sometimes recalled with obvious pride, "I was bought," but Waterlily was only stunned to have this happen to her, and without warning. She did not want to marry just now, and this was not the way she fancied it would be, without any romance. And worst of all, she had no idea what sort this sacred horse might be. He might be quite ugly, mean, stupid, stingy, or old. He might have mannerisms that would disgust her. Why, he might not really want her. Maybe he was joking when he spoke of her. His mothers need not have taken matters into their own hands. Maybe when he found out what they had done, he would call the whole thing off, and would not people laugh at her. Waterlily had long since forgotten she was going to be a perpetual virgin. Life was getting more exciting all the time. If she and some of her girlfriends went to the wood-gathering place at sunset, just for the fun of skillful dodging the eager young men who would try to court them, it was she who had to dodge the largest number of suitors, for she was a popular girl. Last night now, some who tried to speak with her had been total strangers, visitors from far away. Could this sacred horse be one of them? It quite bewildered her. So many unanswered questions, so many eyes upon her suddenly. She was worried on another score, too. Ought she to accept so that her devoted brother, Little Chief, could have those handsome horses? That would be one big way of showing her high regard for him. Well, for him I should. At the same time, she wished there were some other equally impressive gesture she could make that would not be so final and decisive for her. She sat thinking in the teepee while the gift horses waited outside for her answer. And then Prairie Flower came in and told her. "What do you think?" Cousin Ohio said. "He said he wished you would marry so he could have the bay." Waterlily smiled wanly. Then Prairie Flower added, but Little Chief overheard him and gave him a real going over. "What are you saying? We can get our own horses if we are men? Our sister doesn't have to marry against her will for our sake. You should see the little boy hanging his head in shame." Waterlily smiled more brightly. Then that at least was settled. She would not need to marry to please her brother. She found her voice and began to talk naturally with Prairie Flower. And so the horses stood untouched still. But late in the afternoon, Waterlily heard something else that made her start worrying all over again. In the teepee of Dream Woman, her two aunts were talking as she approached. "Are they not handsome?" "They look as fine as those other horses," Dream Woman observed. And her sister, First Woman, the outspoken one, said, "Yes, and it is too bad that our niece seems disinclined to marry the stranger. Those two horses might well have been the answer. He is having a hard time in finding replacement horses as good as the ones we lost. He is very particular and critical. He seeks only the best." She was of course referring to her husband, Black Eagle. The married usually refer to one another in that impersonal manner. Dream Woman spoke up. "We do not yet know how our niece will decide, of course, but if she says no, we must accept it. That is as it should be. Some families who set greater store by things than by kinship might force their girls to marry. But ours is not that kind. In our family, fathers say no girl need marry unless she wishes, and he is right." Waterlily turned away in confusion. Never before had she heard her aunts discussing either herself or her mother. Always they had been loyalty itself. But now, quite accidentally, they revealed that they rather wished the horses offered for her could be part of the giveaway, if only she would see fit to accept. Well, why not? Waterlily asked herself, recalling vividly how her grandmother had always treated her with what love and tenderness. From the first, she cared for me at all times as one of her own grandchildren. How good, unselfish, and long-suffering she invariably was. Suddenly Waterlily was seized with a great obligation to honor the dead woman, a personal obligation. But was it also a kinship obligation? She would go to her mother to learn if she had a duty here, which the tribe would expect her to fulfill. Bluebird was the one to advise her. She had always done so, dispassionately, and had always been right. The girl entered the teepee where her mother was at work and sat down beside her with a deep sigh. Bluebird was very busy sorting out moccasins and tying the mates together face to face by their strings. These many moccasins she and the other women had made in wholesale fashion without bothering to match them up at the time. Waterlily started to help. They must match in size and texture as well as in ornamentation. The mother and daughter worked intently in silence for a time. Waterlily wished her mother would say something. At last she herself broke the silence. Mother, my cousin tells me that she heard my elder brother say he did not want those horses. He did not want me to marry unless I wished to. He thinks that highly of my happiness. He said men should get their own horses and not depend on the marriage of a hakata. Waterlily used the general term for a respect relative of one's own generation. Bluebird smiled, a little sadly, as she said, "That is just like him. He has always been good to you. Ever since he came to our teepee, began to take care of you. If he had been your real brother, he could not have been more devoted." Waterlily went on to repeat Prairie Flower's account of how Little Chief had reprimanded Ohia for coveting the bay horse. Again Bluebird smiled, but not as if the matter could be settled that simply. Waterlily had to go all the way now. Mother, tell me straight, do you think I should agree to this marriage so that the horses can be used in the redistribution rites? There, it was out. She held her breath for the answer. Surely her mother must say, "Certainly not, my child. We do not do things that way in the Tashbaye. You do not have to marry unless you wish to." But Bluebird remained silent for many moments. Then she spoke, choosing her words carefully. "Daughter, it is the nature of things that women marry. And some men, who seem so appealing before marriage, turn out badly. And some, whose fine traits do not show up before marriage, turn out well. It is like guessing in the moccasin game. One does not know until later." Waterlily worked very rapidly, with a concentration out of all proportion to the simple task, and said nothing. Her mother spoke again, as if from the dead. "You and I and our grandmother, killed by tree, came back here because this was where I was born. Our kinsman, my cousin, and your uncle made us welcome at once. He provided for us. His relatives through marriage had never seen us before. Yet they did not act distant, but warmly took us into their life. Your new grandmother lavished as much love and compassion on you as on your own grandchildren, and she took constant care of you and kept you happy. I can truly say that you grew up on her back. For your ceremonies, she always gave of her best, in your name. Thus, she bought a great deal of social prestige for you. Now your uncle is worried because he cannot find horses good enough to replace the ones killed. He does not want just any horses. He wants the best, worthy of his mother-in-law. You are now of woman's stature and have come to woman's estate. You are no longer a child. You know how this kinship matters run. If you are able to do your own thinking, you will see what a good relative would want to do. But that you have to decide." So that was it. Bluebird had first implied the crisscross of kinship obligations that held the people together, impelling them to sacrifice for one another. Then she washed her hands of the matter. Now it was up to Waterlily. having those facts before her to make up her own mind. Suddenly she felt elated, carried away with the nobility of kinship loyalty until nothing else seemed important. Yes, she would marry the stranger. After all, she must marry sometime. And so she would be helping her uncle to honor his mother-in-law. He wanted to honor her, and that was noble of him. And she had always been good to Waterlily and Bluebird. And the grandmother had loved and taken care of Waterlily from the beginning of their relationship. Waterlily was completely involved. She could not step aside. By enabling her uncle to use the horses for the giveaway, she would be reciprocating the kindness and loyalty of both Black Eagle and the grandmother. To do this, she must sacrifice herself. The network of deserved loyalty seemed endless. It left her dizzy, but she knew now where she stood and saw clearly what she must do. Going swiftly to the lodge of Black Eagle, she stood part way in the entrance and looked in. "Uncle, have the horses watered for my grandmother." The men who sat with him spoke their approval. How she loved her grandmother, but Black Eagle said, "Thank you, my niece, but be very sure it is what you really want to do." "I am sure, uncle." Her Aunt First Woman was plainly relieved. How fitting. It shows what my niece thinks of her grandmother's memory. When she said that, she had no idea how a chance remark of hers, overheard by Waterlily, had started the chain of reasoning that ended in her decision. So it was settled. Some of the men of the Tashbaye untied the horses and led them away. Almost at once the news of acceptance was known around the circle. But Waterlily made one condition. "I will marry only after my grandmother's ghost-keeping rites are finished. Till then, she comes first." When that was reported to the family of Sacred Horse, they found it reasonable. After all, they would not be leaving until the Sundance was over anyway. And then they would have a pretty new daughter-in-law to take with them on their journey southward. They were content to wait. Very soon, the girls' friends of Waterlily began coming to see her, to find out how she felt about being bought. They were curious, sympathetic, and romantic. Did Waterlily like the idea? If not, what a shame she felt she must accept. If so, how exciting to be sought out and bought. They did not know whether they would care themselves to be bought. It was a great honor in retrospect. Older women admired the bought women. Young girls were dubious. But don't you know the boy even by sight? Haven't you ever seen him, if only at a distance? It was the inquisitive Alila who was the most forthright, avid to know all the details. "No," Waterlily said, and that was what bothered me so at first. "But now I don't mind very much. After all," she went on, "it has happened before. I am not the only woman to be bought by a stranger. All I want is for my grandmother to be properly honored at the Redistribution. Never mind about me." She spoke this a bit tragically, enjoying her martyrdom for the kinship's sake in the zealous spirit often peculiar to young relatives. "But really, you are a bit worried, aren't you? To be marrying someone you might not even like," one girl asked earnestly. Alila, who always took things lightly, came up with a solution. "Look, there is a way, you know. Why, don't you have to go clear through with it? Just go to his home and let the family make a fuss over you. Accept that as if you liked the whole idea. But then," she was very emphatic here, "but then, just before bedtime, you can run away. If you don't like the man, who could blame you for that? I knew a girl once. It was true that rejection of a husband in a purchased marriage was not unheard of, to be sure. It was not in the noblest tradition to repudiate a promise, but it was condoned under certain circumstances. If a girl had been persuaded to accept against her inclinations, because someone in her family wanted the gift horse, and if before the marriage was consummated she ran away, unable to accept the man, then the marriage was annulled. In such cases the gifts were returned or not, depending on the character of the disappointed wife buyer, who might or might not be too proud to recover them. But Waterlily knew that Alida's airy solution was not for her. The gifts had already been publicly accepted, because she had given her word. It was not to be right to recant now. A woman who once gives her word and then withdraws it is not honorable, as Bluebird's old grandmother had once told Bluebird. The saying was often repeated to girls of marriageable age. The day for the final ghost-keeping rites arrived. First there was the Symbolic Feast, which would be private, with only 4 girl guests partaking of the dead woman's last food. They had been selected by the old widower, Leaping Fawn, Waterlily, Prairie Flower, and Smiling One. However, that morning Smiling One was not feeling well, and Soft Little Breeze, another grandchild of the dead woman, was chosen in her place, though she was only 6 years old. When Dream Woman and Bluebird had finished dressing the girls, it was First Woman who, with unaccustomed gentleness, spread their faces and the center part of their hair with an even film of red paint. Then she gave Leaping Fawn and Waterlily their rightful markings as child beloves. This was the 3rd time Waterlily had worn them for occasions of great importance. As soon as Leaping Fawn was ready, she was called out to hand over the ghost bundle. She entered the ghost lodge and brought it out to the man waiting at the entrance. It was by this time so large and heavy that she could hardly carry it, even with the broad shoulder straps that took some of the weight from her arms. All year long, whenever something exceptionally rare and beautiful and worthy was given by friends, it had been wrapped into the bundle, until the accreted load was the size of 2 very large pillows. With her surrender of the bundle, Leaping Fawn was finished with her self-appointed duty. At no time had she relaxed her vigil or neglected her exacting task, and now that it was out of her hands forever, she felt a little sad. The end of anything is a little sad. Already the ghost lodge without its unseen resident seemed very empty. At the right instant, a woman who had herself kept a ghost, which fact qualified her, came for the girls, bearing in her hand a bowl of powdered incense. They followed her out and stopped at the outer end of the Path of Beauty, which extended about 20 paces from the ceremonial teepee. It had been made earlier, a carpeting of white deer and calf skins, with symbolic painting laid end to end. Along either side, in matched patterns to please the eye, were placed such things as decorated pipes, awls, knives, tobacco bags, and moccasins, examples of the best in all-over work with quills of bright hues. The Path of Beauty was all new and very colorful. While the girls stood waiting for the signal to walk, the crowd of visitors craned to see them. In slender white doe-skin gowns, long enough to brush the grass, they appeared very tall and slim. Their shining black hair hung in 2 braids in front, adding to their appearance of height. The waists of their gowns were heavy with solid work extending to the ends of the loose open sleeves bordered with fringes. All their accessories were in harmony. The artistry of Dream Woman was never more evident. Guests should wear their best to honor their hostess. The rule was here observed extravagantly. Paced somewhat apart, they began walking slowly over the Path of Beauty, the escort going before them and sprinkling their way with the sweet-smelling contents of her bowl. Here and there in the crowd, women exclaimed in low voices at their striking appearance, nor did the significant markings on the face of Leaping Fawn and Waterlily escape them. What pretty girls this Tashbaya is raising. Did you ever see more perfect workmanship than there is on those gowns? See, the 2 tallest girls are beloved. Note the hunk of markings. Such admiring comments were heard all about. But this was a mournful hour for the family. To the visitors, it was as though they had come to witness a second dying of the good woman. Surely it was no time for levity. One ought not to look about for something to be amused at. All the same, it was needful to suppress an occasional smile over Soft Little Breeze. Last in line, she had taken much too literally the order to walk very slowly, until at times she was nearly stationary. Even so, she advanced with an exaggerated dignity that was comical. though she had to abandon it now and then to regain her position whenever the gap between her and Prairie Flower grew too wide. Then, with a hop and a skip, she would move forward, giving a swift kick to her too long skirt, which had been made for a smiling one. If it tangled about her feet, undaunted, Little Soft Breeze managed to enter the ceremonial teepee without tripping. Everyone was glad when she made it. Inside, White Hand, the ghost dreamer, was in full command. He caused the 4 girls to be seated in the honored place back of the altar, which had been decorated with quivering red down scattered over it. The constant motion of the down was a symbol of life, of spirit. There was a large blue square of calfskin lace spread out, and each girl held a corner of it. In the middle of it was the holy food, a cake of pemmican. The only spectators were the girls' parents, their grandfather, who followed by ear only, and several outsiders whose previous record as faithful ghost keepers was their right of entry. White Hand presented the pipe, and as the girls entered, he unwrapped the ghost bundle and hung the hair again on the pole in the center rear. There it hung as at the beginning, pitiful and alone, bereft of all the material things it had been accumulating all year, only to give away as an expression of the precept, "Be generous, for you cannot take materials beyond the grave." White Hand invoked the earth, the universal mother, the final source of all food, and thus of hospitality in the following prayer: "Thou earth, our mother, esteemed by mankind, thou earth, our mother, compassionate toward all that move. On this day, this perfect day of cloudless sky, on this day, have thou compassion on me too, that I may live a long life, a good life. I believe it may be so. I have faith in thee. I rely on thee, and so I attempt this right. Thou earth, our mother esteemed by mankind, thou earth, our mother compassionate toward all that move. On this day, this perfect day of cloudless sky, on this day, have thou compassion on me too, that I may live a long life, a good life. I believe it may be so. I have faith in thee. I rely on thee, and so I attempt this right. Thou earth, our mother esteemed by mankind, thou earth, our mother esteemed by the sun." Thus he chanted the prayer in behalf of the 4 guests. Next he took the cake of pemmican, which had been made with prescribed ingredients, and broke off a piece. He held it over the fire to incense it. As he laid it on Leaping Fawn's tongue, he said to her, "This food I deliver you, this food mixed with perfume leaf and redolent with incense, you shall hold in your mouth, and thereby you shall know that, in future, no matter who it is enters your teepee and sits him down, he shall be your concern, and for him you shall break in two what you might have eaten alone. You shall share." In fact, the extending of hospitality was something referred to as a sweet-smelling deed. To each of the others he gave the food. With these words, the ghost feast was calculated to touch impressionable girls, overcome by the low weeping of their elders and the solemnity of the words. Like a parting admonition from the dead grandmother's ghost, they felt that nothing on earth could be more important than the continuance of her spirit of hospitality. And now the responsibility would fall on them. Should her good deeds die with her? Never, if they could help it. The ritual was over. Outside, the spectators seated on the grass were served a general feast of good food in superabundance. The women had come properly prepared, with a sack or other containers for the food they could not consume there. It was the custom to do this. It was rude to leave anything that had been served. Guests must take it home for future enjoyment. The redistribution followed. The average guest received some small gift, perhaps only a knife case or a pair of moccasins, but the special gifts were given for special reasons. The 2 fine horses made possible by Waterlily were given to White Hand in recognition of his devoted services all year. The finest articles, which had been added to the ghost bundle from time to time, went to guests who had themselves once kept a ghost, and the symbolic articles, which were wrapped in with the hair at the beginning, were especially awarded, as was the custom. The 4 knives went to the 4 outside women who had come to assist in the preparations and had laid the path of beauty. The 4 awls were given to the girls, who at the private feast had eaten the ghost-perfumed food. They were a symbol of the womanly arts that the girls were expected to acquire. The 4 pipes would be carried thereafter by White Hand and 3 other holy men selected by him, and the disc of abalone shell, known as holy men's property, and permitted only to dreamers, would be worn by them. Sometime during the day, unnoticed, those 4 holy men took the ghost dreamer away. But where and how they buried it was their secret for all time. They were under religious compulsion never to reveal it. Unlike the usual giveaways, always loud in praises and cheering, a redistribution was solemn and slow. In a sense, it was no different in quality from the regular giveaway custom of honoring one another with single gifts, but here in the redistribution it was epitomized, heightened, and crystallized in one magnified act of giving. The gifts given to friends were the things given by friends throughout the year to be added to a pile of goods that related families were amassing. In the redistribution, then, property was once more leveled. The blessing lay not so much in giving or getting as in having a part in this, the dramatizing of cooperative generosity. That evening, after the last guest had left, the many relatives gathered around a common outdoor fire, weary but happy once more. They were grateful that all their friends had rallied to their undertaking. They were satisfied that they had done their utmost for their dead, each with his own thoughts. They sat in quiet until the old man spoke a kind of valediction to close the year-long effort. Now let her good spirit go freely hence to the land where spirits abide. We have caused it to linger with us for a spell. We have detained our loved one some seasons longer amid honor and reverence. We have enabled her to prolong it yet a little longer, that hospitality which was her chief delight. She has set one last example of generosity for the people. Now let her go in peace. The great encampment of the Sundance, so impressive and so full of life and activity during the days of celebration, always became a dismal sight at the close. The visiting groups began early to dismantle their camps and continued to do so, each at its own pace, all day long. And as more and more departed, they left wide gaps in the circle, skeletal camps with only poles, posts, stakes, and the willow withes used in the construction of temporary shelters to take care of the overflow, all the standing at crazy angles. Instead of the cheery open fireplaces that nightly glowed with welcome, only a continuous ring of ashes and dead embers remained. By evening, only the large section occupied by White Ghost Camp Circle stood intact. They had been the hosts. This was the center of their territory. At their own convenience, they too would break camp and be on their way, but not until all the guests had departed. The last group to leave was that from the Black Hills region, and when they left, they took Waterlily with them. Whatever her feelings, she was quietly ready when the 2 mothers of Sacred Horse came for her. Her womenfolk kissed her tenderly, while the men took her hand in farewell. Bluebird held her to her breast for one moment and kissed her, but there were no tears. Tears should be controlled, except at death. It was a bad omen if someone broke down over a mere parting. It meant that the death would come to one or the other of those taking leave of each other before they could meet again. When they were well on their way, Sacred Horse rode up and took the rope by which his mothers were leading the horse Waterlily rode. They surrendered it without comment. Only then did Waterlily recognize him. She had, after all, seen him before. Of course. He was that very well-dressed young man at the courting hour the evening before the wife-buyers came with the gift. Waterlily recalled that Alila had cried impulsively, Will you look at that stranger? I hope he is headed my way." The other girls had said, "Why, Alila, you shouldn't say such things. It is not becoming." But perhaps they were all hoping the same thing. At any rate, it was towards Waterlily that he had walked, smiling and silent. But she had eluded him, as was the way of Dakota girls who had been properly trained. Acting on advice of their sex, if he really likes you, he will try again and again. Let that be the proof. Do not consent to him at once. Perhaps he would have tried again and again, but his indulgent mothers had got ahead of him anyway. Here he was, riding beside Waterlily. She said nothing, and he did not try to make her talk. Thus they traveled, walking their horses so slowly that after a while they lost sight of the others ahead. It seemed as if they were all alone in the world, so vast and empty was the land. They would travel alone all the way home. As she thought of her own people, Waterlily felt so homesick that she pulled her wrap over her head and cried softly as they rode. After all, she was still only 18 winters old and had never been alone with total strangers before. She could not adjust herself to the new situation without a few tears. But Sacred Horse must not see them. He must think she was just bashful of him. Suddenly he spoke, almost stern in his haste. "Here, hold these," and thrust the reins of both horses roughly toward her. It startled her so that while she fumbled for them, her blanket slipped down. She quickly raised it over her head again. Already he was running off to one side, crouching low, and setting an arrow to his bow as he ran. Near a cluster of wild plum bushes up the ravine, he fell on one knee and let the arrow fly. Then he went around the bushes. The next instant he came back, with a young deer slung over his shoulder. While he worked at tying it fast on his horse, he remarked casually, "There, now we can have some fresh meat to boil our first evening." Waterlily said nothing. Though she was no longer crying, she did not even feel lonesome. So busy she was admiring the expert way he had gotten the deer. But she continued to hide her face, not wanting the tear traces down her cheek to show. They rode on again in silence. After they had climbed the ridge and were going along over the uplands, he said, as though he were talking to a third person about her, "You know, she must be some relation to the deer. She cried because I killed it." It was an indirect compliment, for in myth and belief the deer was an embodiment of feminine allure. Waterlily laughed outright, and her laugh with her, and then she began to feel more cheerful. It seemed to her that everything was going to be all right. He had been very kind and considerate of her, and very patient. She thought she would like him.